Hi, my name's Rachel, and today we're talking about a virus sweeping the nation. And no, it's not COVID. It's CRT. No, not critical race theory. It's conservatives repeating talking points. Take a look at some of the infected.
Critical race theory is being forced into our children's schools. Embrace the vision of Martin Luther King, where children are not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Critical race theory goes against everything Martin Luther King has ever told us. Don't judge us by the color of our skin. And now they're embracing it, right? They're going backwards.
I don't know if some of you guys have seen this critical race theory. It's basically teaching kids to hate our country and to hate each other based on race. It puts race as the most important thing. I want content of character to be the most important thing.
You gonna sit here and tell me this lie of critical race theory? This the reason why black folks can't get ahead because of white folks? Are you kidding me? This is what we come to. I can't believe we even talking about this right now. The last thing we're gonna say right here is something that's crazy. Martin Luther King said he wanted his kids to grow up in a world where they are judged by the contents of their what? Character. Not their skin. If they let this stuff on right now, it is absolutely doing the complete reverse.
Anybody that thinks that critical race theory is positive is really just dead wrong. The bottom line is that anything that would teach us anything but loving our country and loving one another and judging people based on the content of their character solely is just flat wrong.
A lot about critical race theory. So what is it? This is a form of teaching that teaches our kids that America is systemically racist and that you're either an oppressor or a victim, and judge a person by the color of their skin, not the content of their character.
As the Reverend Dr. King famously said, and he was right, we should judge our fellow citizens by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin.
Americans want a country that is colorblind and that subscribes to what Dr. Martin Luther King said in his dream speech, that we should judge people by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Nearly 60 years later, radical far-left Democrats are doing everything possible to eliminate this dream through the implementation of critical race theory.
Martin Luther King Jr. said it best, as I quote, "My 4 little children one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, by the content of their character." Again, not by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. Why is Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophies being rejected and kicked aside? I would think if most Americans understood what critical race theory is, they would consider it evil.
Are you noticing a pattern? I sure am. Today we're going to be talking about this book and the fact that people have decided to invoke one particular line of one particular speech that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made in order to present themselves as not racist and understanding of the civil rights movement and well-versed in Dr. MLK, but also as opponents of critical race theory and Black Lives Matter. They have decided collectively that colorblindness and neutrality is the way to promote equality in the United States, and they have cherry-picked this one particular line from Dr. Martin Luther King to prove their point, instead of looking at the entirety of his work and the work that led to him being murdered and led to being, before he was murdered, labeled a communist and a traitor to the United States. The same work that is continued today through his children. And in fact, when one of the same people that I just referenced in video talked about Martin Luther King on Twitter, Dr. King's daughter Bernice said, "Hey, maybe not. Please read my dad's work and please stop fucking taking him out of context." I'm paraphrasing. This repetition of a singular line and willful ignorance of what critical race theory actually is a purposeful effort in order to muddy the waters and simultaneously confirm their own bias. They're muddying the waters on what critical race theory is, on what Black Lives Matter stands for, on what defund the police stands for. They conflate all of these things together, label them bad, say Dr. Martin Luther King would never, and then because they've used a black man from the civil rights movement, they can assuage their own guilt. I'll talk about this purposeful effort and this guy in another video. He's responsible for it, and I'll go into depth about that. Right now I'm going to focus in on the civil rights movement and the co-opting of Dr. Martin Luther King's words and the whitewashing of history. It is easier, and they do this, to say we had a black president and Martin Luther King had a dream. That dream was achieved. End of story. But in fact, critical race theory was formed specifically because the dream was not achieved. But now it's being called neo-Marxism?
Well, it contradicts everything that Martin Luther King fought for. It's hatred, Marxist ideology, and it places the child in a loophole of oppression.
Here's the woman who coined the term critical race theory, Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a professor of law, because critical race theory is a law theory. Here's her explaining what it actually is and answering the question, is it Marxism?
The Marxism, that's their favorite one. They're using that every single time. And I hate to ask dumb questions, so please don't think that I'm dumb. Is critical race theory Marxism?
Look, you know what? Here's the thing, Joy. Critical race theory is not so much a thing. It's a way of looking at a thing. It's a way of looking at race. It's a way of looking at why, after so many decades, centuries actually, since the emancipation, we have patterns of inequality that are enduring. They're stubborn. And the point of critical race theory originally was to think and talk about how law contributed to the subordinate status of African Americans, of Indigenous people, and of an entire group of people who were coming to our shores from Asia. And the point was, quite frankly, to understand the problem in order to intervene in it, to understand why the greatest hopes for our republic were not being realized, even though these hopes were encoded in law. So critical race theory just inherits the beliefs and the hopes of Frederick Douglass, of Martin Luther King, who basically want the law to do for the freed people what the law did for enslavers. And we picked that up in the 70s and 80s after the civil rights movement to say, okay, so now we've had this big civil rights movement. We have all these laws in the books, but things really aren't looking as different as they should if we are really the society that we say we are. So we put about the task of understanding how law wasn't just the neutral referee. Law wasn't always on our side. In fact, law was less on our side than for on our side. And we wanted to tell these stories in order to do better with the promises that are embedded in the Constitution. That's what's in critical race theory.
Similar to how critical race theory is being redefined and bastardized by people who don't know what it is but are terrified of it, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his words and his legacy have been taken and stripped and manipulated in order to form a very particular narrative. I'm not actually here to talk about critical race theory at all. I've already done that in another video, and I will link it down below, but I'm also going to link Kimberly Crenshaw, again, explaining in depth what critical race theory is. So that's all down there if you need it. Hint, it is not what the conservatives are saying it is. It's not white people bad. Teach kids that, whatever else nonsense they're preaching today on Fox News. I read this book and we're going to be using it as a jumping point to talk about the co-opting of the civil rights movement. We're talking about a very specific mental phenomena that happens in the United States. This book calls it a national fable, and it's something that I am absolutely appalled by. So, as I said, it's like the co-opting of the civil rights movement, the leaders, what they actually said, what they actually stood for, the whitewashing of history in order to promote a particular agenda and assuage guilt. I'm going to use excerpts from the book, quotes from Dr. King himself, and I'm also going to dunk on conservatives in my local area who are borderline white nationalists who use MLK to make their own points. Yikes. This is the first in what I hope to be a series on this subject if I have the spoons. Alright, from the book. Racial injustice is America's original sin and deepest silence. The ways the country came to honor the civil rights movement were not simply about paying tribute to these courageous acts and individuals in the past, but also about sanctioning what will and will not be faced about the nation's history and present. Explained former Birmingham Mayor David Vann, the best way to put your bad images to rest is to declare them history and put them in a museum. This co-opting of civil rights leaders is very popular. It is in most of our history books and is done, surprise, surprise, by white conservatives en masse, as I showed you in video clips. It's very much done in my area of Florida, USA. Please kill me. There's a group here in Tampa, near where I live, called Community Patriots of Tampa, and quite frankly, I think what they do is horrendous. Here's some examples of them co-opting Dr. Martin Luther King in order to prove a point against Black Lives Matter. In 2020, communities across Florida experienced riots and public disorder on an unparalleled scale. I would just like to point out that 93% of Black Lives Matter protests were peaceful. I'm just saying. Businesses were disrupted and destroyed. Residents were unable to leave their homes as rioters blocked the streets. Diners were harassed by violent protesters at restaurants. In some communities, these riots went on for weeks, forcing businesses to close their doors once again. In certain areas, local politicians told police to stand down during the protest. The First Amendment of the United States Constitution affirms the rights of its citizens to peaceably assemble and the right to petition our government for redress of grievances. America was established by people fleeing a tyrannical government. Our Constitution was forged as a guiding document for this new country. The Community Patriots unequivocally support our Constitution and the right to peacefully protest. We support our law enforcement officers and first responders. We condemn acts of violence against all living creatures. We condemn destruction of property, both public and private. We condemn the obstruction of law-abiding citizens conducting their businesses freely and safely. Generations of Americans before us, we will preserve our rights affirmed to us by the Constitution. In the words of Martin Luther King Jr., we adopt the means of nonviolence because our end is a community at peace with itself. We will try to persuade with our words, but if our words fail, we will try to persuade with our acts. Sincerely, the Community fucking Patriots. Thanks, I hate it. I hate when they do this. And in another post, honoring Martin Luther King Jr. on January 18th. This was days after the Capitol insurrection, and I just want to point out to you that this exact same group has a Facebook group where they were all saying that the entire insurrection was not conservatives for Trump, but actually Antifa in disguise, and I was kicked out of the group after pointing out that that's false. Honoring Martin Luther King Jr., I say to you that our goal is freedom, and I believe that we are going to get there because however much she strays away from it, the goal of America is freedom. Insurrection is wrong, so yikes. Multiple times they have referenced Martin Luther King, taking him out of context, and sometimes just flat out lying, like that post about people being unable to open their businesses for weeks. That's not true. I live here. Using him as if he would disapprove of the Black Lives Matter movement and approve of the bullshit that predominantly white moderates and white conservatives in this group do to promote militarization of the police, which he was vehemently against, the military-industrial complex, the war, fascism, and more. Dr. King was against all of those things. Who did he say was the problem? White moderates, not protesters. From his letter from Birmingham jail in 1963, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the KKK, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in your goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action. That is literally exactly what this post is. That's, I can't. Okay. It's easier to ignore things that he actually said and cherry pick quotes in order to fit them into a very particular narrative that you're spinning. It's a lot harder to actually give a shit and look at the entirety of his work and respect that work and respect that legacy and that legacy that continues on with his children today, the work that they are still doing. But instead we have decided to collectively ignore in favor of this national fable. We have decided to collectively ignore the fact that Dr. King, Muhammad Ali, Rosa Parks, these people were all outspoken socialists who were labeled treasonous and communist in their time. When MLK was assassinated by a white man, he held a 30% approval rating among United States Americans. But now his image and his work and his words are taken and co-opted by people who likely would have treated him like garbage had they been alive in the 1960s. However you treat Colin Kaepernick right now is exactly how you would have treated Martin Luther King back then. But now that he is dead, it is very easy for people to teach, as I learned in school, that he was a man who made a speech about a dream and suddenly everything was fixed. This isn't true. But him being gone, it's really convenient to spin a new narrative that works for them and reform his legacy into something palatable for them in order to wield it against dissenters now. From the book, invoking the civil rights movement has become a clever suit to assert one's enlightened bona fides. It crossed party and ideology. In the process, these inspirational stories, with their distortions, embellishments, and omissions, had taken on the power of a national fable. This fable became a new way to paper over the long history of struggle and enduring racial injustice in the United States today. With their element of self-congratulation, these often bipartisan acts of memorialization whitewash the history of the movement, becoming a veil to obscure enduring racial inequality, a tool to chastise contemporary protests, and a shield to charges of indifference and inaction. Dr. King is dead and he cannot speak for himself. And even though his own daughter is saying, hey, you're wrong about my dad, his own words prove you wrong, they speak over her and continue to listen to other white people who are scared of having discussions surrounding race because they do not want to be held accountable for the way that they allow these systems in place to persist. When I say they, I mean we. It's just that I agree that the systems are in place, so I'm separating the people who do not from the people who do. I am not saying that I am not white. I am absolutely, definitely Elmer's glue white. And so this repetition happens where they hear something and they're like, I have decided that this national fable sounds good to me and assuages my guilt, so I'm going to just repeat it. And you can find the proof of this by simply looking up on Twitter, or maybe on Facebook as well, I tried Twitter, the keywords MLK, CRT, and content of character. And behold, you will find an enormous amount of people repeating the exact same thing you heard a bunch of people do at the beginning of this video. Take a look. these people are subscribing to and regurgitating without any nuanced thought or discussion is an ahistorical take. From the book, this history as national progress naturalized the civil rights movement as an almost inevitable aspect of American democracy, rather than as the outcome of Black organization and intrepid witness. It suggested racism derived from individual sin rather than from national structure, and that the strength of American values rather than the staggering challenge of a portion of its citizens led to its change. So what it's saying that America was so awesome and had such good values that as soon as Martin Luther King said, "Hey, I have a dream," people were like, "Yes, I'm so American that I agree with you." That's not what happened. He had a dream. He made a speech. We moved on from this dark era of American history. No, they're acting like the evil was revealed like a Scooby-Doo villain, like they pulled the mask off and they were like, "Oh no, it's racism." Found the culprit, episode ended, we can move on, we never have to talk about it again. New episode, we don't have to talk about that old villain racism anymore. Wait, Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. MLK already did the thing and unmasked. I don't like this. From the book, it is the recycling of the beliefs that once revealed, real injustice is eradicated in a democracy like America. Excessive behavior, anger and recklessness, and refusal to behave respectably or to use proper methods for expressing grievances, remember this post, by a new generation of Black people is again cast as the cause of many current problems, and such behavior must be checked and challenged to maintain this noble progress. This has happened repeatedly, including during Reconstruction. Our history teaching in the US, not to the fault of teachers whatsoever, is just such garbage. So it doesn't surprise me that they don't know that many things did not change post MLK. Even with the Civil Rights Act, some things were changed, but then some things were changed and then walked back. Some things were never changed because they were never technically on the books, de facto racism. So therefore, people could make a case for it. That's not racist. And this book goes into depth with quite a bit of that, especially with school segregation. How a lot of that was not technically on the books. It did not actually say Black children cannot go here. And because of that, white people were able to say, see, it's not racist, it's fine. It's really hard for them to believe that MLK making a speech did not lead to the amount of change that they think that it led to. This is a collective effort by the right to look at history in a way that gives us present day absolution. And that's not only ahistorical, it's selfish and immoral. And it's a way of exercising power continuously over the marginalized. From the book, the recounting of national histories is never separate from present day politics. What of the past is remembered, celebrated, and mourned is at the core of national identity. And the process of what is told and not told is often a function of power. It sort of reminds me of this James Baldwin quote.
The American sense of reality is dictated by what Americans are trying to avoid. And if you're trying to avoid reality, how can you face it?
James Baldwin, another person that we don't learn about in our history books in the United States. Martin Luther King did not, as a concept, promote colorblindness. At no point in his speech did he say, I promote colorblindness. That is not what he meant by content of character. Neutrality was never the path forward that he saw toward equality. He said that they would fight for justice until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Explain to me how you get justice through neutrality. King himself said he who passively accepts evil is as much involved in it as he who helps to perpetrate it. He who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it. Here's another clip of Kimberly Crenshaw where she's talking about intersectionality, not critical race theory. She also coined the term intersectionality, and she is talking about the concept of colorblindness and how people wield it.
Colorblindness also is used to denounce a certain kind of social policy. So you would know those social policies by the terms that they're used to frame them. So used to denounce something called preferential treatment, used to denounce affirmative action, even now used to denounce traditional kinds of anti-discrimination interventions. The idea being that all of these things are departures from some kind of neutral baseline. And when you depart from a neutral baseline, you're actually engaging in preferential treatment. What is neutral? Neutral is colorblind. What is not neutral? What is preferential? What is preferential is paying attention to race in order to do something, right? So colorblindness tells us what the neutral baseline is. And finally, colorblindness helps us define racial equality as symmetrical treatment. So if we've decided that race cannot be the basis for which any kind of social policy can be used to pursue, then essentially we're creating an idea that equality is achieved when we treat people in a symmetrical way. And so what I hope you'll be able to see in a second, that particular notion of equality is not new. It's over a century old, and it was actually a conception of equality that was used to to undermine the first Reconstruction, and I will argue it is essentially doing the same thing now.
Colorblindness is used in a similar way to how families deal with abusers, or even the way that they deal with maybe someone saying that there's a favorite in the family. The avoidance of discussing the problem is preferred, and if you bring up the problem, you are actually the problem. There's no abuse here. What are you talking about? Everyone is equal. You saying, oh shit. There's no abuse here. What are you talking about? Everyone is equal. You saying there's inequality hurts me. Are you saying that I'm a bad family member? Because racism is seen as an insult rather than a call for accountability. So therefore they derail the conversation before it even starts, because saying there's a fundamental flaw being ignored is somehow more hurtful than the fundamental flaw's existence. There can't be a flaw. We're equal. We're colorblind. We're working from a position of neutrality. We're so much better off than we were before. Abuse used to exist, but it doesn't anymore. If you're saying there's abuse, then it means that we're not better and that we have to be held accountable, and that hurts my feelings. Come on now. All of these things are an attempt to distract from the problem and diminish the problem, and instead center the discomfort of the person who needs to just fix things. Center the discomfort of the white person who perpetuate the problem by not discussing it. Colorblindness does not work, and I'd argue that it is a lie and it doesn't exist. But that's a different video. The point is that Dr. King did not ever advocate for such a thing, and to say that he did, to believe that he did, is a lie. It is a falsehood. Colorblindness is not something he talked about, and to say that his content of character comment was about colorblindness is a lie. Let's talk about MLK versus BLM. Dr. King versus Black Lives Matter.
I like Martin Luther King, and I don't like Black Lives Matter. Martin Luther King wanted his children to be able to live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That was his dream, to not have to judge people by skin color. But if someone at a Black Lives Matter rally says all lives matter, which to me means roughly the same thing, they get shouted down. That's not cool.
From the book, across the political spectrum, from presidential candidate Mike Huckabee to Reverend Barbara Reynolds to Atlanta Mayor Kasim Reed, many made comparisons with the civil rights movement to critique and chastise new movements for justice, holding up the civil rights movement as the right way to do it, and Black Lives Matter as the wrong way. I'm going to again reference my local group of ahistorical anti-science idiots. There is an effort made by opponents of the Black Lives Matter movement in posts such as this to say that MLK would not protest the way that BLM does. And my question to them is, have you ever read Letter from Birmingham Jail? Ever? I mean, my God, you're literally saying the exact same thing now to protesters that the white clergy said that MLK was referencing in his Letter from Birmingham Jail. They put out a statement, the white clergy put out a statement saying MLK's present activities were unwise and untimely. Sound familiar? And while in jail for protesting, he responded to this accusation. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are indeed right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Non-violent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. My citing the creation of tension as part of the work of the nonviolent resistor may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly opposed violent tension, but there is a type of constructive nonviolent tension which is necessary for growth. Just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, so must we see the need for nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. The purpose of our direct action program is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. And you may say, wait a minute, Rachel, didn't he just say multiple times nonviolent action? To which I will respond, one, okay, then why are you so mad at Colin Kaepernick? Because that is the epitome of nonviolent action. And two, more than 93% of Black Lives Matter protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd were peaceful. Just say the quiet part out loud, community patriots. You think racism is dead because we had a black president. You don't want people protesting racism in any way, shape, or form because you don't think it exists. this. You don't care if it's peaceful or not peaceful. What you say shows this. Whether it is peaceful or not, you call upon a dead man and whitewash his legacy in order to beg silence from people who have the right and the freedom to protest the ways in which they are treated and the ways that you perpetuate that treatment. So shame on you. From the book, there is something deeply ahistorical and ironic to call for voices muted, tactics softened, disruption avoided, and more honorably spokesmen located, when these very criticisms were lobbed at the civil rights movement as well. And there is something convenient too, a way of justifying remove by making it seem as if people would join movements such as BLM if the upstanding likes of Rosa Parks and MLK were a part of it, but these new movements were just going about it the wrong way. It's always about protesting the right way. This is me doing quotes with my phone in my hand. Always about protesting the right way, but they can never define what the right way is. They always find a way to find something wrong with it. And that's because it's not really about the protesting. For example, take this interview with Tomi Lahren, where she denounces both BLM and Colin Kaepernick and is asked repeatedly but cannot answer the question, how should they be protesting?
I don't agree with what he did.
Yes.
I think that he went about it the wrong way. I don't think
Black man in America who says, I don't know how to get a message across. If I march in the streets, people say I'm a thug. If I go out and I protest, people say that it's a riot. If I bend down on one knee, then it's not. What is the right way? That is something I've always wanted to know.
taking it out on our flag and our national anthem, to me,
But how?
why would you take out your perceived oppression of black people out on the national anthem and our flag?
The guy is kneeling in the corner. I don't understand why that offends you so much.
I disagree with it. And so he has every right to do it. That's his First Amendment rights. And I agree with his First Amendment right to do it. I don't agree with what he did. So because I don't agree with what he did, then now I should shut up? Because I'm white, so I should shut up? I shouldn't be able to talk about black issues because I'm white?
I'm saying is, I asked you one question, and that is, how should a black person bring up their grievances? That's all I asked. How?
What he said was he is protesting the anthem and the flag because of the oppression of black people in this country. I would like him to further explain what he's talking about when he's discussing the black oppression in this country. I don't think that that is the correct outlet for your anger. So what is he protesting? So he's...
Again, you haven't answered my question of how. I just want to know if you've ever thought of the how. That's what I want to know.
Because I feel like I'm a woman and I'm marginalized in some way, I don't protest my country. I don't see what he's protesting. I would like to know exactly what he is protesting. It's a very...
So how do you... No, how do you protest then? That's
I don't protest because I'm not a victim. I don't protest because I'm not a victim. I don't protest because I'm not a victim.
And there it is! The mask comes off! There is no answer to what is the right way to protest. Because the truth is, they don't want any sort of protest. Peaceful, non-peaceful, they don't want it. If they were okay with peaceful protest, they would say nothing about Colin Kaepernick. Because they believe the oppression is perceived and not reality. And the longer that people say the oppression is not perceived, the more agitated they get because they don't want to be reminded that they are accountable. I'm absolutely convinced that a riot merely intensifies the fears of the white community while relieving their guilt. But it is not enough for me to stand before you tonight and condemn riots, without at the same time condemning the contingent, intolerable conditions that exist in our society. A riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last 12 or 15 years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice and humanity. Notice that his priority is about condemning white complacency and white silence, rather than condemning first and foremost the riots. A riot is the language of the unheard. There would be no rioting if there were no white complacency. It's never really about the protest or how the protest happens, not really. It's the fact that the protesting makes them uncomfortable in general. And this is the same thing that they did to Dr. King. Even white moderates did this to him. MLK was for civil disobedience and for making noise. He was hated by the majority of the US and labeled a traitor and imprisoned multiple times. But dead men makes very convenient heroes, so now he's used as a shield, while people who are white moderates, for the most part, throw accusations like word grenades at the oppressed, tarnishing his legacy. From the book, by diminishing the substance and scope of American racism and what the movement actually involved, these renderings work to maintain current injustice, at times chastising contemporary protesters in ways similar to the ways civil rights activists were demonized, and blind us to how we might do it again. The fact is, most of what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was fighting against still exists today. The injustices that we see now are mirrored by what he saw then. He would not accept it. Freedom is a constant struggle. I will never, ever not take the opportunity to reference this book. I love you, Angela. Bernice King has taken to Twitter to put folks on notice. She has made it clear that if you are evoking her father's name, you better be speaking out about the injustices that Black and brown people face today in the United States. She says, as you tweet about my father today, know that he organized and protested against voter suppression and believed that the ballot box is on the path to justice and freedom. Standing against voter suppression is one great way to honor him today. Let us march on ballot boxes. A Georgia voting law signed in March of this year imposes new voter identification requirements for absentee ballots, empowers state officials to take over local election boards, limits the use of ballot drop boxes, and makes it a crime to approach voters in line to give them food and water. Voting rights groups have said this law targets Black residents and other voters of color in the state. This is one of the nation's most restrictive voting laws. King's daughter, as well as the children of 2 other prominent civil rights leaders, have spoken out against this. A recent American Psychological Association study revealed that police officers speak to Black drivers in a more disrespectful tone during traffic stops than the way they speak to white drivers. A 2007 U.S. Supreme Court ruling helped put an end to the Seattle public school system's attempt at increasing integration, and schools have become segregated again, like the neighborhoods they sit in. And the Seattle School District has other problems, including its disproportionate punishment of Black students. School segregation remains very common throughout the United States. The U.S. Supreme Court in 2013 gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and legislatures in several states enacted laws that don't mention race but have a disparate and negative impact on people of color. American women die in childbirth at a higher rate than in any other developed country, while non-Hispanic Black women are more than 3 times more likely to have a maternal death than white women in the United States. The gaps in education between white students and Black students that were present 50 years ago still exist today. Black people are more likely to be shot and killed by police than their white counterparts. Black unemployment is at twice the rate of white unemployment. White family wealth is still about 7 times greater than Black family wealth. Black men are more than 6 times as likely as white men to be incarcerated in federal and state prisons and local jails. Black citizens are more than twice as likely to live in poverty. Black Americans still make much less money than their white peers. Every aspect in which Dr. King fought for equality for Black Americans, every system that contained racist aspects still needs work today. If you think that he would not still be marching and speaking out today over these things, then you are willfully ignorant, you are uneducated, and you need to do better. Again, however you treat Colin Kaepernick is exactly how you would have treated civil rights leaders back in the 1960s. So maybe the problem is you. You can start working on this. You can easily do what Dr. King's daughter asked and read his works. Particularly his 1967 speech, Where Do We Go From Here? This speech, he highlighted inequality in education, which still persists today, noting that Black students lag 1 to 3 years behind white students and receive far less funding. It's 50 years later and these achievement gaps still persist today. Also, I highly recommend reading this book. It's much more extensive than what we've gone over here. Actually, most of everything that I've said here just comes from the introduction. I think that this should be required reading for middle school and high school students, but you'll probably accuse me of being for critical race theory, even though you don't know what critical race theory is. You're just against an accurate teaching of history. I'm gonna be that mom that puts on nonfiction audiobooks in the car when my kids are older, and they're gonna be so bored. It's gonna be great. But today, you're all my kids, and I'm telling you that if you don't stop lying about Martin Luther King, I'm going to take away your cell phones. You don't deserve to have internet if all you're gonna do is lie and spew bullshit all over the internet. Resources down below. Go follow Dr. King's daughter, Bernice. Her Twitter is linked down below. There is so much information out there. Read a book. Stop watching Fox News. Stop listening to Breitbart. Stay away from OAN. Read the entirety of Dr. King's works. Please, for the love of God, I'm begging. That's all I have for you today. Thanks for watching. See you next time. If you want to support my channel, I have a Ko-fi link down below. All my social media accounts are also down there. Like and subscribe. I will see you next time. Bye.